Hello everybody, today on one of the hottest days of the year I want to talk about something very hot indeed, and that is going to be the term negative space. This is not something that I've really covered on my channel prior because it is something that I've really been experimenting with lately. And essentially what the idea of negative space is going to be is that silence is an inherent part of the musical idea. Now, of course, this might sound very abstract, but we're going to dive into the project and we're going to have a look at some practical examples. But before that, I just want to talk a little bit about what led up to this discovery and why I was thinking about this. In essence, over the last few months, I've been playing a lot with specifically volume automations on a lot of my different sounds. And mainly what I noticed myself doing was making volume automations that turn off at a certain point. So I would have the sound playing at a steady level, for example, and then the sound would end and immediately I would cut it off so that it doesn't have any form of tail to it. Say that, for example, it has a long delay or a long reverb that is then being cut off by the sound turning silent. And to give a good example of that, here we have one of the sounds where that happens. So for example, we have this guy over here. You can see that through the automation, it just goes from 0 dB to minus infinity and then back. And that means that there's a clear space where something else gets to happen. Instead of its delay tail that is still playing here, its reverb tail that is still playing here, the spectral time which might still be doing things, the beat repeat which might still be doing things, all of that is going to get cut out in this area and we're going to have complete silence here. And in this case, this is used to have kind of like a vocal shout, which I'm not entirely happy with, but also to have a key change there. So I noticed myself using that a lot more in my writing technique, and I've been thinking about what it actually means to use volume in that way and how you would almost classify it as part of the track itself. Because mainly I would say that there's like two versions of this idea. One is where you use volumes to switch between ideas, like we see over here. We have one synth kind of playing, or at least two synths we have kind of playing, and then they stop at a certain point. We have this vocal shout coming through and then they continue again. But of course, also within an idea itself and specifically within a rhythm itself, it can be very useful to leave in some silence. So for example, we have the synth, the main synth that you hear in here, that like kind of gritty FM synth. The reason why this FM synth works in here in this part of the track is because it also plays over here, but it has a lot of silence in there. And in this particular part, it's just leaving a little bit more space for that other synth to play. But also, this being the rhythm that it's playing is a nice setup for it becoming faster later. If you were to play that throughout here and we're not using silence as part of this rhythm that is playing in this part of the track, it is not going to be as effective in this part of the track over here. Another place where you're going to see silence from time to time is going to be grid synths. Now, this is a fairly full one, but I believe that there's one or two spots where there's a little bit of silence in there as part of the rhythm. Specifically argue that the pauses over here towards the end of this sound seem to be a nice, more like tranquil spot where it doesn't really sound like there's a lot going on. You can hear a lot has changed since the video that I did on these grid synths in particular. And as I predicted in that video, I was getting rid of a slidey synth that at the end of the day I just really didn't like. But one of the things that I always try to take into account is that the groove isn't continuous with these grid synths, that there's always a little bit of a, almost like a motion in there, almost like a pull-push kind of pumping idea in there. In a sense that there's just parts where it plays a little bit faster, there's parts where it plays a little bit slower, there's parts where there's a little bit of silence, I believe. Yeah, so the silence in this part would be over here. Because this is the last sound that plays, then on the offbeat here there's nothing playing because of course this sample also doesn't play. And then in here there is a little bit more playing, but you can say that this is the slowest part of the grid synth then. And that kind of gives it that push and pull idea, where we have other parts where there's a lot of different things happening all together and layers on top of each other and in quick succession. And then there's parts where there's a lot less happening, to the point where we even have parts which are just complete silence. Now, another way that you may have noticed that silence plays a huge role in my productions nowadays is with the kick and bass, and specifically the variations that I'm doing. I've also covered this in another video, so I won't get too deep into it, but essentially these are just parts where you're stopping the kick and bass. And what I mainly like to do is stopping the bass and then doing either something with the kick. So we either have like double kicks or reverse kicks or that kind of stuff, or we just have the loop kind of stopping and giving a little bit of space for other elements to kind of break through more, like in this case over here. It's really made to have these grid synths, these part of the grid synths come through. That really just kind of gets to shine if there's no bass playing, because it has a lot more space, of course, in the mix. But there's other parts too, like these kind of small fills where there's just a little bit of silence, where we have a little bit of space for the main melody to come through. So that is again the stop in the idea. Another place where I tend to stop the idea quite a lot is in stuff like atmospheres, effects and vocals and that kind of stuff. The more backing stuff, I would say, because you don't really notice volume cutouts as drastically as you would on the main element. So for example, over here we have these atmosphere guys. You can hear that right now it's pretty jarring the way that it just cuts out from being this like atmospheric sound and then it suddenly slashes out there. But within the context of the track, this does really seem to work. One of the reasons why it works is because it is of course not the only element that stops playing right here. We also have the kick and bass just stopping, but we also have fills starting to play. And as you can see, the grid synths stop here as well. And we have other synths kind of coming in and taking over. So this really is that kind of point where stuff kind of switches, and having certain elements ignore that switch actually makes them sound less cohesive with the rest of the track. So that atmosphere continuing make it sound like these two guys are actually more connected than I want them to be. I want there to be this staccato feeling, because this is going to be one of those switches where really the idea of the transition is just this jarring kind of cut between the two ideas like this. As opposed to what you often find yourself doing in psytrance, which is kind of more flowing between ideas. Give an example for that. There are some flowy elements in here in the sense that the melody already starts to play, for example. But other parts would be, say over here, these guys kind of come in and then we slowly flow into the melody here. And you will therefore also notice that a lot of the atmospheres either just continue in the fill, or they play in the fill, but they're not getting cut out by any volume. There isn't any like volume happening on here that is saying, okay, this right here is where the fill starts, and this is where we're going to turn off and we're going to go to minus infinity. Same is going to be true for stuff like effects. The effects just kind of continue in here. In this case, I have it rising up until the actual point of transition, which is not something that I often like to do. Usually my risers and any building elements tend to rise up till the start of the fill, or somewhere in the fill from which the transition starts to happen. But sometimes you want that really nice like flowing transition where everything seems to build up to the moment that you're actually switching, which is where the kick and bass starts to play again. And therefore it can be effective to just have everything play up until that point and not really bother with cutting out ideas or cutting out elements prior to the actual switch happening from one idea to the next. So experimenting with this kind of stuff is fairly important, and both with the way that you're using silence in the arrangements and cutting individual sounds, as well as using it within an actual rhythm, within the idea of the elements that you want to present within that arrangement. Maybe you have a certain kind of groove playing that is just kind of playing continuously. What can be the case is muting a couple of the sounds that make up that groove makes it actually sound better, because there are some moments of rest in there and it's not just this continuous kind of barrage of sounds coming at you. So hopefully this video could inspire you to use silence in an interesting way. Let me know if there's any other ways in which you use it in the comments down below. And another way to support the channel is of course to like and subscribe. But you can also support the channel financially, which you can do by either becoming a Patreon, YouTube member or Twitch subscriber, or by checking out my products over on Gumroad, Payhip or Adrenochrome Store, which both are amazing ways to support the channel and support what I do here. So thank you if you do that, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.